So, chapter 6. We're at the tail end now, right? The end of the letter. And thereby, obviously, an end to this particular study on Galatians. We're not at the last lesson itself, but we are on the home stretch, as it were. We are in the conclusion of the letter proper, is what I'm really referring to. Today we're going to cover verses 11, 12, and 13. So we're going to subdivide this ending down into at least two parts, 1 to 11 and then 14 to 18. We may also actually subdivide the verse 16 into its own verse as well. I'm still making a decision about that. But long story short, we're in the last couple of lessons, nevertheless. So let's read the passage and then we'll go from there. Galatians chapter 6, verses 11 to 13. See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. As many as are wanting to make a good showing of the flesh, these are trying to compel you to be circumcised, simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, but they want you to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Alrighty. As I mentioned, this is the actual ending of the letter itself. It's noted by a particular orthographic emphasis, as we would say, which comes to us in the form of verse 11. So see here, in this case verse 11, see with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. I explained this all the way back at the very beginning of this study when we were doing the overview of the letter and covering some of the basic outline of context and place and peoples and other such things. That this letter has a rather unique literary feature, namely that Paul himself, the Apostle Paul, actually does physically write the letter, or this portion of it, himself. It's okay. And we know that apart from the fact that he very obviously says, see with what large letters I am now writing with my own hand. But the reason why that's notable, and we explained this all the way back at the very, very beginning, was that letters in the ancient world, and this is a common way of doing things, were written by scribes. You would dictate. Okay, you would say your letter, what you want to have written, and then a scribe would write it. There's a variety of reasons why that was the case. Sometimes it was due to personal illiteracy. Someone may be wanting to write a letter, but they don't actually have the knowledge or skills of writing. But often it was just simply by virtue of ease of function. The person is able to speak freely, and then the scribe is able to do their job of actually putting that in a proper epistolatory form, in other words, a proper form of how a letter should be written. And so that's the way that this often occurs. Part of this is aided on Paul's part by his eye condition. We actually covered that back in chapter 5 when we looked at that specifically. The issue of his eye condition that he uses to make a point about blindness, spiritual blindness in chapter 5. But nevertheless, this is a normal way of doing things. However, he, by the tail end here, obviously snatches the writing instrument out of his scribe's hand and then begins to commence writing himself, okay, and does so in a larger majuscule form than what the letter would normally be in, right? So when he says, see with what large letters I am writing with you in my own hand, what would that be? Pilakois grammatis, where we get the word grammar from, as in like English grammar, right? Large letters. And so he's making a very concerted decision, which probably is largely born, at least this is the general theological interpretation, which I would hold to, in his anger that's expressed through this letter, he decides to have this personal ending or this personal note, literally in his own hand. And that's emphasized by this, see with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. He's emphasizing that he's now the one literally writing the letter, which is not common. As I said, he doesn't do this really, generally speaking, anywhere else in the New Testament. Okay, this is a particular portion, at least in this particular way, where he decides to actually start writing it literally with his own hand himself, which gives us an insight to a whole host of things, but at least in simple terms, it gives us the insight of how serious this letter actually is and how serious the issues of this letter are. We've constantly looked at and seen and explored the reality here that these issues discussed in this letter concerning the Judaizing heresy and enslavement to the Mosaic Code and ritual elements having been fulfilled in Christ, but now the Judaizers, both without and within, seeking to try and ensnare the Gentile Christians back under the Mosaic Code, that this is an issue that directly impinges upon the gospel and upon basic Christian dogma, right? As emphasized by his lack of introduction or normal introductory remarks that he usually makes. The fact that in this letter he does not refer to the Galatians as fellow saints in the Lord, right? Which would normally be at the very beginning, between kind of verses 4 and 5 in chapter 1, where we point that out when we were there. And then the fact that he then writes, essentially he's on such a rant that he takes the pen out of the writing instrument, the quill, out of his scribe's hand and then starts writing himself. These are all features that go toward the serious and stern nature of the letter and the particular sentiment or sense in which Paul is actually writing this letter, right? See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. Verse 12, as many as are wanting to make a good showing in the flesh, we'll get back to that in a second, these are trying to compel you to be circumcised simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. We've explored already throughout our time and through our journey this dynamic between the circumcised and the uncircumcised party, right? Between the Judaizers and the Gentiles. The division it's caused vis-a-vis his recounting of events in chapter 2 of the book, where the communion table is divided, the Judaizers and those under their sway won't eat alongside of the other Christians, the Greek and Celtic ones. Peter even temporarily sides with the Judaizers out of cowardice, which he later repents of. We discussed all that. But out of cowardice, he sides with them. And Paul openly rebukes him in the middle of communion for that. All these kind of things. But here he's really kind of drawing to a head the ultimate conclusionary note, so to speak, of the hypocrisy and cowardice of the heretics in Galatia. Right? As many as are wanting to make a good showing in the flesh, in other words, all the kind of solely, S-O-L-E, solely externalized entrappings and accoutrement of religion without any of the inward reality, just like the Pharisees, right? The whole whitewashed tombs filled with dead men's bones slur that Christ tells at them rightly. As many as are wanting to make a good showing in the flesh, they're wanting to take pride in the fact that we are Jews, we're circumcised, we are descended from Abraham in the flesh, blah, 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 which has been a huge central kind of subject of this, especially in chapter 3, which we spent a lot of time in, right? That it is in the seed, singular, not seeds, plural, that's chapter 3, that is Christ. Christ is the seed of Abraham. So every time we see, to recap, which is appropriate here, because we're in the conclusion of the letter, to recap from those portions of chapter 3, the references going all the way back to Genesis 12 and following, to Abraham's seed being blessed, and through your seed salvation will come, all these kinds of things. He points out here, the Apostle Paul, that the seed is Christ, okay, singular, not plural as in a people, right? And that thereby, by the time you traverse through to the end of chapter 3, all those who are in that seed, Christ, that descendant, singular, are the heirs of Abraham and are the rightful inheritors of all that was promised to Abraham. Right? Because, as the chapter spends a lot of time talking about, especially in verse 6 and I think verse 11 as well and elsewhere, the seminal promise given to Abraham is that the just, or the righteous, same word, right? The righteous shall live by faith. Okay, so all those with the same faith of Abraham in the same object of that faith, which is the descendant of Abraham, Christ, right, are made righteous, right? Justified. Where we get the word justification from. Okay. However, the wanting to make a good showing in the flesh is a boasting in their own flesh. Okay. That we're physically descended from Abraham, that's what matters. We are the seed. This is the common rhetoric in the first century, especially among the Pharisees and others. And that is the source of their boasting, or their good showing, in other words. Right? It's the kind of encounter that the Lord has with the Pharisees in John 8. Yes, John 8. John chapter 8, where Jesus calls them slaves, right? You're enslaved to your unbiblical oral traditions that you brought back with you from Babylon, is ultimately where those come from, right? And you have ensnared and enslaved the people along with you. Right? They then say, well, we are descendants of Abraham and we've never been slaves, which is laughable in the light of the Exodus, from when they were released from slavery. They'd been enslaved. The northern tribes had been enslaved to the Assyrian Empire. The southern had been enslaved to the Babylonian Empire. They were then enslaved, albeit not literally, to the successors of Alexander, the Seleucid Empire. Now they were functionally enslaved, although much more in a partnership form, to the Romans. So they were wrong on both counts. And then he goes on to explain, long story short, that's where he has his famous saying, before Abraham was, I am. Okay, it's one of the great I am statements, there's 7 of them in John. Etc., etc. The good showing in the flesh, that's just going back to the prevailing problem, that the externalities alone will not save, because they cannot save. Okay, it doesn't mean that externalities don't matter and it's only inward that matters, because after all, this is another parable of Christ. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles man, but what comes out. Okay, that's where he declares all foods clean. We've covered this actually in some sermons before. Point being, though, is that every tree bears its fruit. Okay, so what in reality, the problem would be kind of doing a big pendulum swing to the opposite side, right? Where it's only the inward that matters, not the external. But how do you assess the internal? Well, it's through the external. Okay, you can have externalities without the inward reality, spiritually speaking. Okay, because you can, like it says here, good showing. You can put on a good show, right? Without having the inward reality, and that's just hypocrisy. It's spiritual hypocrisy or religious hypocrisy. What you cannot, however, have is the inward reality without then subsequently, or consequently really, the outward reality. Okay? So it doesn't cut both ways, right? You can have outward without inward, but you cannot have inward without outward. Okay? Because it will manifest in your lived life. Does that make sense? Yeah. Ergo, you shall know a tree by its fruits. Okay, that's the essence of that parable philosophically. The good showing, however, that's why it's not only the outward that can be the measure, right, but it's the inward that is the ultimate measure, okay? So that's why we're called then, because the question is, well, how do we then tell the difference between true and false externalities in a religious practice? Well, through the means that God continually says over and over and over again, discernment. Born of wisdom, right? So wisdom, which teaches or brings about discernment, the ability to discern, literally to decipher, to divide between the two things. And so in that case, it's all right. The discernment aspect is how we then determine those things, right? We discern. And so by virtue of this, the discernment aspect then comes from wisdom, and we use that wisdom in light of God's law to determine the truth of the inward matter, okay? Because its externalities can deceive. Here, the externalities is actually something very obvious, and that's what he's picking up for in our particular passage. It's circumcision, right? So literally in the flesh in this case, okay? So as many as are wanting to make a good showing in the flesh, these are trying to compel you to be circumcised, right? Because that's what they were doing. They were spiritually manipulating and coercing the Greek and Celtic Christians in Galatia to do that as necessary for salvation, right? That you have to become effectively the simplistic way of thinking about, or really oversimplified way, pardon me, of thinking about the Judaizing heresy is you must become a Jew to become a Christian. Okay, that is at least at its kernel what it does functionally. Okay, and so these are compelling you to be circumcised simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Okay, so there's actually a very duplicitous, insidious, and ultimately cowardly reason as to why they're doing this, and this is what he's kind of revealing or pulling the veil back on. Right? Their ultimate reason for doing this is because they are afraid of persecution at the hands of the Jewish authorities. That's the problem. Okay. Paul, of course, knows this better than anyone because he himself spearheaded that operation, that program, prior to his conversion. Okay, we have that when we obviously covered that during our previous study in the book of Acts, where he himself was appointed to be the leader or the commander of that operation that would go around Judea hunting down the Christian churches. And of course you have the famous Road to Damascus event. That's when he's on his way to raid the Damascus church and to kill them, right? And then things play out from there, blah, blah, blah. So he knows this better than anyone, right? And he knows why they're doing it, right? This is actually the kind of wisdom I'm talking about, right? He doesn't necessarily need to have found some secret playbook from them that reveals that we're really doing it. No, he just knows. He knows, right? He used to operate in this mindset. He used to be one of them to a degree, not Judaizers, but he used to be on the side of the Pharisees and others who were influencing all this, right? And he knows full well that this is why they're doing it. It's ultimately to avoid persecution from the Pharisees, the Sadducees, from the Jewish authorities. Because keep in mind, we explained this all the way at the very, very beginning in our context lesson. Roman persecution, as in imperial persecution, right? Pagan Roman imperial persecution has not functionally begun yet. Okay, the first of it begins about a decade after this time under the Emperor Nero, who reigns from AD 54 to 68. Okay, so 54 to 68. He then commits suicide in 68. This is already during now the outbreak of the Jewish-Roman War, which becomes the subject of various portions of the New Testament, particularly the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. That's the first instance of more direct Roman imperial persecution. Up until this point, keeping in mind that we're in the late 40s here, chronologically speaking, right? The persecution is still only from the Jewish authorities in Judea, okay? And expanding rapidly elsewhere, right? If you read through the book of Acts, we see that, right? Where often Paul will come into a city, and like Philippi, for example, right? So it's the letter to the Philippians, right? He comes into Philippi, and the Jewish rabbis and elders in that city already recognize him, right? Or they realize it's him, okay? They may not have met him, but they've certainly heard of him, right? He was already a famous rabbinical student and rabbi anyway in his youth, easily the most talented as well. And his conversion was infamous among the Jews in the first century for obvious reasons. He was the arch traitor of that time period, okay, without question. And so his infamy, in reality fame and renown for God, but infamy to the Jews, spread far beyond where he had ever gone, right? So he was, his renown outpaced him. This is what I'm talking about, okay? And so they're doing it. Ultimately, they're compelling you to be circumcised so that you're just like them and that they won't be persecuted as well. Because they're the sign of that they would then reveal we do have accounts of this as well throughout early church history, including in the first century from Josephus to a degree, if coming under persecution from the Jewish authorities, would then say, oh, no, I'm not a Christian, look, I'm circumcised. Right? And they would use that as cover, effectively, for denial of the faith. Okay? It's similar to what ends up happening later on at different points throughout early church history during the imperial persecutions, where, in a different kind of way, but also external, so quite similar, where the emperors at various times, like in the Decian persecution in the mid-3rd century, so 249 to 251, a short but very heated 3-year persecution, where the Emperor Decius demanded empire-wide imperial cult worship. Right, he was wanting to revive the imperial cult back to its former glory, and so demanded that all subjects everywhere in the empire go to their nearest local temple, make veneration and sacrifice to the emperor, and they would receive what's called a libellus, or a libelli, plural, right? Basically like a certificate, effectively. Okay. Once, you only had to do it once in your life. It wasn't like you had to do some repetitive thing, you just had to do it once. Okay. So seemingly quite an easy job. It doesn't take much time other than waiting in line. But then to solve the problem of waiting in line, they would have mobile votive carts that they would take around to save the queuing. The Romans, of course, were known for their efficiency and administrative prowess. But nevertheless, Christians either did one of 3 things. Either one, they didn't cave and were subsequently martyred and killed. They either went the opposite direction and apostatized and caved, to their shame, or they tried to take a middle road, which was likewise frowned upon, which was basically playing on bureaucratic corruption and bribing kind of middle management Roman officials to give them a libellus, because a number of middle managers in your local province figured out that they could make a quick buck on the side by just simply giving the imperial seal on the libellus and saving people a whole bunch of time. Right? They did it for Romans as well, who just couldn't be bothered to do it. So they were making kind of cash flow in this. So Christians took that. Some Christians went that route. So they didn't technically make sacrifice, but they had the certificate saying that they did. And that was rightfully frowned upon because, A, for starters, you're under the fatal impression that you can trick God. B, it is entirely out of self-preservation, not self-sacrifice, which is really what the Christian ethos is. And then C, which is maybe more the pragmatic element here, is that it would, how would I phrase it? Well, essentially it would allow you to have the externalities of being able to provide cover for yourself when the Roman soldiers would come around or the police would come around. And you, who had otherwise been previously thought of as a Christian, potentially in your local setting, are now showing that you've made a sacrifice to the emperor and to the gods by general, so that you can save your own skin, but you're now showing a sign of treachery, right? So those Roman soldiers walk away thinking, this is working. The Christians are caving in. You see what I'm saying too? So the message it sends, the optics, right, were bad. And it was rightfully condemned by many of the bishops. And so, this is the kind of concept that's going on here. It's a similar thing, quite similar actually, just in a different context with different enemies. In this case, it's the first enemy that comes along, which is the extant Jewish authorities. And the Jews generally, culturally, who decide to not maintain the faith of their forefathers, right, by becoming Christians. They apostatize and persecute, which is what's going on. Paul was part of it. And so the Judaizers here, he's explaining, he's showing under the hood what the ultimate reason is. And it's simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ, right? They're afraid of sacrifice, they're afraid of being persecuted, by the Jews for their faith, the true faith, having the same faith as Abraham, because the people persecuting them have deluded themselves over the course of centuries into thinking that they hold the faith of Abraham, whilst rejecting now the one who was the descendant of Abraham, Christ. Okay? It's the other big thing. We've covered this a lot of times, I know, throughout this book, but the important thing to always remember and understand, because the Apostle Paul here he actually makes this point indirectly in this book when we covered it back in previous chapters, as does every single church father, bar literally none. To encapsulate it in the words of Saint Justin Martyr from the 2nd century, one generation removed from the apostles, Christianity did not come from Judaism. Judaism came out of Christianity. Okay? It's a perversion. He uses the word a perversion of Christianity. The common misconception through just general lack of knowledge, which is understandable, is that Judaism is merely kind of what we do minus the New Testament. It's just the Old Testament stuff, right? That's generally the common view. The problem is that that's not accurate, right? I don't want to go through all the theology that we've looked at from this letter throughout our time in the study, but it's not, it never was. Certainly not even by this particular point, and certainly not in the days afterwards, right? The preponderance of what the Pharisees and the Sadducees hold to is in one form or another taken and brought back as a descendant oral tradition coming back out of their exile in Babylon. Okay? Many of the rules that they hold to in terms of liturgical purity, sacrifice, various other elements are very directly linked to Babylonian religion. Very much. So that's why eventually, when they codify these ideas in what becomes known as the Talmud, which is the central text of Judaism for about 800 years now, that starts to become codified in the late 2nd century, AD, not BC, AD. Builds up, it takes a couple of centuries for it to get properly codified, but the two versions of it are called the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. That's why, right? And it is the codification of the kind of ghost of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which get wiped out during the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Okay? They're gone, but their philosophy and their teachings kind of echo and reverberate forward, right? Among those who don't become and continue on as Christians. Okay? Josephus estimates that maybe a third, roughly, of Judeans, or Jews as we say them in English, became Christian. Okay, they believed in Christ. Okay, about a third. That's his estimate. 2/3 did not. Okay, that third survives the Church of Jerusalem. Everyone else almost effectively is gone after the destruction of Jerusalem. And then obviously all around the rest of the world, it's split. Some Jews become Christians. If they're Hellenistic Jews, right, they live in Alexandria, they live in Corinth, they live in wherever, right? And others don't. Right? So that's kind of how it all subdivides out. But the point being is that to understand much of the thrust of this letter, to understand the point he's making here about persecution for the cross of Christ and et al., is that the religion that they hold to, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and those who have sided with them and not with Christ, is the diversion. Okay? It is apostasy. Right? They think that they're on the right track, and that the Christians are the ones who are apostatizing. In reality, it's the opposite direction. Okay? The New Testament is but the continuation and fulfillment of the Old. Right? The New Covenant is but the capstone upon the Old Covenant. Okay? That's why, even though he's writing to a predominantly Greek and Celtic audience here, he can say, as he said multiple times throughout this book, our father Abraham. Okay? Because the physical, i.e. like genetic, ancestral descent, is not actually the definition or the category. Okay? It is in relation to Christ, but from Christ, all those connected to him, it's a spiritual connection, not a physical one. That's the entire point of this book. He's writing that as someone who is actually physically descended, genetically or ancestrally, from Abraham. Right? That's where it lies in. The religion that predominated in Judea during this time is one of apostasy. It has fundamentally different beliefs. Well, let me be more clear. It had fairly accurate beliefs about the Christ, to be totally honest with you. It just simply rejected it. Yeah, just exactly. Just simply didn't like the fact. Okay. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are not idiots. They're quite intelligent, right? They were not fools. Well, sorry, they were fools. They were not dummies, is what I mean to say. They were not stupid. They knew portions of the Old Testament text. This is why, for example, when you have the slaughter of the innocents during Christ's infancy at the hands of Herod, he's not an idiot, nor are his scribes, right? The Magi from the east, from Babylon, who are astronomers or astrologers, same thing in the ancient world, see, I won't go too much into this, it would take too much time, but long story short, see the star that we think that we have accounted for us, what would be called the king star in the ancient world, right? Has to do with Jupiter and other things astronomically as far as their beliefs go. Blah, blah, blah. But long story short, they see Regulus, the star, they see that this is the sign of a coming king. They would have had that because the Jews spent 70 years there, right? So they know a lot of they've come to know in Babylon some of the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, right? Blah, 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 the Israelite scriptures. And they arrive, of course, then at the Herodian court saying we're here to bring gifts and such anointings for the promised king. And he's like, well, I'm the king. So of whom do you speak, right? He and his scribes gather together, and it takes about 5 minutes to figure out that they're here because they are under the impression that the Christ has come, right? So they know what this says, and his own scribes tell him this. It's there in the infancy accounts. So his reaction is not, oh no, that can't be true, this must be an imposter. No, it's just simply, kill him. Right, kill him. No, I don't want that. It's a rejection. That's what it ultimately is from Herod, right? It's not like they don't know what these texts say. They all figure this out pretty quickly, right? Because Daniel, as in not me, but the one I'm named after, specifically foretells when this was going to happen anyway, right? That's the whole 490 years, or the 70 weeks prophecy, right? It brings you all the way up until the time in which the prince, the Christ, will be cut off, killed, right? Which brings you right up to the beginning of the 30s AD. Okay? So they know full well that this is the time. That's why concepts about when a Jewish Messiah will come are just prima facie ludicrous, because Daniel specifically foretells when that will happen. From the rebuilding of the temple under ultimately the Persian Emperor Artaxerxes II, all the way through, and you just count forward how many years. He foretells a week equals 7 days, a day equaling a year. It's Old Testament prophet stuff, but anyway, long story short, and it brings you right through the beginning of the 1st century AD. Okay, they know this, and their decision is still hunt him down and kill him. It's just rejection. It's apostasy. They don't want it. Right? That's why this is so important to understand this, because without understanding that historical context, you'll miss a lot of the points of emphasis in this letter as to why he's so angry, as to why, righteously so, as to why he's so blunt and direct in some portions. Why, like when we covered where he famously or infamously says, it'd be better for these people if they're so concerned about circumcision, it'd be better if they castrated themselves and died. Right? It'd be better if they just bled out and committed suicide as a result. Right? Things which seem un-Christ-like, I say that tongue-in-cheek, right? Which don't seem very nice, but yet are clearly inspired by God and are in our scriptures. Right? Here is where he's explaining and revealing the ultimate reason. They have been persecuted, so simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. They are too afraid of the Jewish authorities who are hunting us down. Now he says us down, how he would have to say that, right? How I used to hunt you down, which is what Paul did, right? And that's why they do this. They are afraid of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priests, the elders in various regional cities, whatever else, right? They're afraid of them, okay? Which teaches us a couple of things before we move on to the next verse, right? Verse 13. It teaches us that that central ethos of sacrifice is just that, a central ethos. It's a central component of our religion, and that is sacrifice. Obviously, centered and built around the sacrifice of Christ, that goes without saying, right? But the concept that comes out of that from a philosophical and moral perspective of self-sacrifice, okay, is something that is incumbent to everything that we hold to. It's something that's really ultimately unique to us, to be honest with you. The willingness to self-sacrifice for what is right, what is true, what is good, using that all synonymously here, ultimately, that is to say, for God himself, okay? That is at the heart of everything that we do, even in the face of, to use the operative word here, persecution, okay?
So these people who were wanting to get everybody else circumcised, were they turning into Christians or pretending they were Christians?
Yeah. So they're ethnically Jewish, right? They have, at least on the surface, converted to Christianity, at least in those terms. They're part of these churches in Galatia, but they're teaching all these various false elements to them, right? So that's why he's declaring them to be heretics, okay? Because they're teaching a different gospel, that you have to become Jewish to become a Christian, right? It's why we've got to be careful at times where phrase it accurately and sensitively. I understand conceptually, I totally do. Intellectually speaking, I totally understand what people mean, generally speaking. I'm speaking in generalities here. But in a general sense, I understand intellectually what people mean if they said that Jesus was a Jew, right? I understand intellectually. You mean ancestrally. That's generally what people mean, right? It's like ethnically speaking, yeah, that would be an accurate statement. But it does require qualification. In fact, a lot of qualification, right? So if by Jesus was Jewish, we mean that he believed the same things that the Pharisees and the Sadducees believed, that's definitely not true. Okay. If by Jesus was Jewish, someone means that he held to the same things that are in the Talmud, definitely not true, right? If we mean that Jesus is Jewish in the exact same kind of way that like a modern Israeli is Jewish, even that's also not true because of how long they spent, particularly in Eastern Europe, over the last 2,000 years, right? So it requires a lot of qualification. When we use the English word Jew, what it's really doing is it's an English translation of Judaios, meaning from the Greek meaning Judean. In other words, someone descended from either the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, the southern kingdom, keeping in mind that the north was conquered and effectively carried off to the ends of the earth by the Assyrian Empire back in the Old Testament, right, in 722 BC, right? Hence the 10 lost tribes, right? All that remains is the southern kingdom of Judah, hence Judean, later on from the Romans. Judah and Benjamin, they go into exile in Babylon, they come back out of exile from Babylon, live under the Greeks, eventually then by the time of the 1st century BC make a deal with the Romans to kick out the Greeks and then become a vassal of the Roman Empire. That's where the Judean element comes from, right? The Roman province of Judea, right? So in that sense, how do we then mean it? Because it also included Samaritans, and the Jews definitely didn't consider the Samaritans to be, even though they were, right? So in what sense do we mean? Because he's also technically not from, he's born in Bethlehem, but he's not called Jesus of Bethlehem. He's called Jesus of Nazareth because he's from up north in Samaritan territory. So he's also actually not even from Judea proper. This is what I mean. It requires qualification, right? But often the way it gets used of Jesus was a Jew or Jesus was Jewish is to create some sense of equality or affinity with modern Judaism, and that's dead wrong, right? Absolutely dead wrong, okay? They here are twisting and contorting the nature of what Christianity is for insidious reasons, right? Which ultimately end up becoming born of what he describes in the verse 12, like we're talking about. Demanding that the Greeks and the Celts here in Galatia ethnically adopt and become Jewish through various Mosaic customs like circumcision and others, which we've discussed in the book, to then become Christian. Right? Whereas that's not true. You go directly through Christ. You don't go through the external fleshly things, right, of the Mosaic code. Okay, that's why elsewhere in the scriptures, like in there's a couple of different places, does it, but like in Colossians 2, for example, very clearly around verse 11 of Colossians 2, baptism is the new covenant replacement for circumcision, right? Because he equates, he describes how ultimately in the old covenant, the circumcision of the flesh was as a sign for the circumcision of the heart. Okay, the cutting of the heart, right? It's a new birth, right? Regeneration. He then explains baptism now does this for us, okay? Colossians 2. Elsewhere, Peter does this in his epistles, blah, blah, right? So in the new covenant, baptism replaces circumcision almost directly, okay? That's another lesson. But point being, let's round off there, verse 12. So, last verse, verse 13. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, but they want to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. Now, we'll subdivide this verse into two, right? First clause, second clause. So the first clause, for those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, right? So he's pointing out, he's kind of building on the last sentence, obviously. He's pointing out their innate hypocrisy, okay? When he says they don't keep the law, he is speaking in the much more, he's speaking exactly like Christ would speak about the law, okay? Because they would turn around and go, what are you talking about? We do keep the law. We get circumcised, we observe all the old festival days, the high holy days. We observe the Sabbath, so we're doing the stuff on Saturday, we're doing this, we don't eat the pork and don't eat everything else, and blah, 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 blah. But they don't do it perfectly, which is actually what God's standard is, right? You uphold every law all the time, in all ways, at all places, or you have sinned, right? You have engaged in metanoia or metanoias, right? You have fallen short, okay? Without getting deep into a lexicographical lesson, the inherent, some of you may have heard of it, but the inherent meaning, at least in the Greek, of metanoia, where we get the word ultimately for sin, is a term that Paul takes and others from archery, okay, from ancient archery, like in the Olympics. Right? And to shoot an arrow, right, have it fall short of the target, that's the word that gets used in ancient archery. Okay? So sin is a falling short of the target at which it was aimed. Okay? The analogy there, which is quite apt, is that the target is God's law. It is the divine standard. It is God's commands himself, right? I think. That is the standard, right? So God himself, his character, and thereby the divine law, which is sourced from his being, that is the target, okay?
So metanoia.
Yeah, meaning falling short from an archery term. Yeah, exactly. Falling short of the target. Yeah, and so that's the meaning it carries in the ancient Greek, right? Which this is written, obviously. To fall short of. Okay, and so in that particular case, anything short of that constitutes sin, whether it's by a little bit or a lot. It doesn't really matter. The term covers everything from a millimetre outside the bullseye to 50 feet short. Okay, all it is a matter of degree, and there are degrees of sin, right? Which is why when we come to the human law, the lex humanis, which is the application of divine law in the civic sphere, so like civil codes, right, laws that we write. There are different degrees of punishments for certain crimes. That's a fulfillment, ultimately, or an alignment with the ancient biblical concept of lex talionis in the Latin, right, an eye for an eye, okay, the law of talons, in other words. In this particular case, what this means is, in the divine sense, whether one falls this much short or that much short or that much short, it's not talking about human law. It's talking about as far as God's concerned with divine law. It's all sin. And whether one falls short by this much or this much is still short, and technically infinitely short because of his infinite character, but that's a whole different philosophical lesson. All that is to say that when he says here, in the first clause of verse 13, for those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, the irony of their hypocrisy is the fact that they are more, they're more certain than anyone else that they do keep the law, which is the irony of their hypocrisy, because they are so self-righteous in their own external trappings that the internal reality has been lost on them. That's the problem. Because if they did have the internal reality, they would know all have fallen short. There is none good, no, not one. Right? Romans chapter 5 and elsewhere. Okay? Just go basically read the first 6 chapters of Romans and you get this picture through and through. Chapters 1, 2, and 3, he's building the basic foundational element of the universal sinfulness of man, Jew, Greek, Roman, anyone else in between, in all various ways, the need for salvation, the need for justification, the fact that justification or righteousness comes by faith, not by works of the law or works of paganism or anything else in between, as I said, and builds up through chapters 5 and 6 where the antidote to that is first provided, right? Really chapters 4, 5 and 6, but certainly by the time you get to 5 and 6. Anyway, the point is that they do not actually keep the law themselves, truly and ultimately. Okay? So those who are most zealous for upholding these traditions don't even do it to the standard that Moses himself outlined, which would be perfection. Right? And that's the hypocrisy. And so, which is why famous instances like the Sermon on the Mount, right, and elsewhere, you have heard it said blah, 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 but I say to you blah, 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 blah. It's not a new law, it's actually just the deeper, more accurate understanding of the law, right? You have heard it said you shall not murder, but I say to you, if you have hated your brother, you've already murdered him in your heart. That was always the case, right? That specific thing is condemned in the Old Testament, not just murder, but hatred for brother, right? Which is your own kin. We've explained the term brother before, right? Brothers means like your actual, those who you're related to ethnically. It has a broader application in the context of the church, but that's a different subject. So here, for those who are circumcised, do not even keep the law themselves. So they're hypocrites, right? Which is the ultimate irony, okay? But they want to have you, and this is where it gets interesting with the direction the pronouns are in. But they want you, they want to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. It's like, notice it doesn't say they want you to be circumcised so that they may boast in their flesh, although that would be a problem anyway. It's not internally directed, it's actually externally, which is interesting. But they want to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. Okay? What is this saying? Again, these verses are him, as we said at the top, peeling back the layers, giving the peek behind the veil to show and reveal through truth, to reveal the heart of their insidious actions and their beliefs. They don't want to be persecuted, so they're cowards. That's the end of verse 12. Beginning of verse 13, for those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves. That's hypocrisy. So cowardice, hypocrisy, and then now here, but they want to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. That is manipulation or abuse. Okay? What they're doing is they're conniving and planning and scheming to ensnare and pressure, which is a lot of this, especially going back to chapter 2 when we looked at that. The reason why Peter caved is through pressure, manipulation. right? He caved to propaganda. He caved to social pressure, right? What we might call peer pressure, I suppose, right? He caved to peer pressure or to social pressure from those around him, who were effectively saying, "You're not a true Jew, because you've sided with the Gentiles." Okay, you can go back and read chapter 2 to see that and the direct and indirect points there. But they want to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh, showing us, see, this is actually how you're meant to be a real Christian. A real Christian would become like us, Jews, because we're the chosen ones, and we have the prophets, and we're the sons of Abraham, and blah, blah, blah. Things which he's been railing against all throughout this letter, okay, and proving to be false, right? That's why chapter 3, when we covered it, we spent so much time there. So we spent more time in chapter 3 than anywhere else, right? Because it is the epicenter, apart from the fact it's literally the epicenter of the letter, but it is theologically the epicenter of the letter, okay? Without chapter 3, you will not understand the rest of the book, but more importantly, you really won't understand entire swaths of the book of Acts, okay? Because a lot of the interactions between Paul, who's the focus of the latter half of the book, right? First half of Acts, the first act of Acts, pardon the pun, focuses on Peter and others. Then the second act or the second half focuses on Paul and his companions, right? Barnabas, Titus, Timothy, etc. Right? In both accounts, but especially the second half of it with Paul, a lot of that will get missed, right? Because of the theology in chapter 3, where he very clearly explains what is the true nature of the seed of Abraham. What is those promises? What do those promises mean? What's the fulfillment of them? Who or what is Israel? Blah blah blah. Like these kinds of things, which he covers in great depth in chapter 3. That's all coming to a head here. They want to have you circumcised so they may boast in your flesh, because you now become their tool. You now become effectively a piece of propaganda, where they can then go to others, continue to spread their heresy and say, look at all these Christians over here who have done the right thing and obeyed Moses' law and got circumcised and uphold the Sabbath and the festivals, uphold the dietary laws, uphold the clothing laws, all the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? They're wanting to utilize you, is what he's saying. They are manipulating you, they're coercing you, they're using you, right? And you're not seeing it. Okay, that's why he's writing this letter, right? They're using you. To borrow a Stalinist term, they are treating you as a useful idiot. Okay? They're treating you as a useful idiot. Useful idiot was a term, as I say, it was a Stalinist term. It was a term used in the early days of the Soviet Union. Both during the Red Terror under Lenin, so like 1918 and 1922, later on during the Stalinist period, of particularly the 30s especially, and the 40s, but particularly the 30s, to describe apparatchiks and those at the lower end of Soviet society who were sometimes the most zealous and fervent of apparatchiks, so operators, right? Those who worked for the General Soviet, to investigate their fellow Russians, to run the gulags, to man the prisons, to run lower end operations for the NKVD, right? The intelligence network, for the Cheka, for the secret police, blah 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 blah. And they were sometimes they didn't have huge levels of authority. They were kind of lower end operators and workers, or even just up to middle management. But they're often sometimes the most passionate and zealous. But behind their back, Stalin and the rest of the General Soviet referred to them as useful idiots. Right? They're tools at our disposal. Right? They do our bidding for us. Right? All the while thinking, in the blindness of their own ideological consumption, that they are, well, they wouldn't say doing God's work because they're atheists, but doing good, that they are spreading the great ideals of Karl Marx and of Vladimir Lenin and others, and that we are allowing the workers of the world to unite, and we're engaging in class struggle to bring about a brighter, more progressive future, and blah, 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 all the usual rubbish. Useful idiots have always been, in an ideological sense, the most dangerous, because you can at least identify and target the kind of purveyors of ideology to a large degree, but useful idiots are infinitely manufacturable at an almost industrial scale, right? Because you indoctrinate one person, or you manipulate one person, who then goes and spreads it to 2, and those 2 spread it to 4, and those 4 spread it to 8, and those 8, you get the picture, right? And that's what's going here. That's why this whole thing arises in like about a year and a half, right? We're not 100% sure on the dates, but at least we do have a rough idea from a historical archaeological perspective. These kinds of issues, like Paul is working through Galatia, so Caesarea Philippi, Antioch in Caesarea, Derbe, Lystra, these kinds of other, Pisidian Antioch, that's what it was, the Pisidian Antioch, Derbe, Lystra, these kinds of southern Galatian churches and regions, right, these cities, which he goes through in the book of Acts. It's the late 40s when he's there, probably around like the year 47, roughly speaking, okay? Council of Jerusalem happens in Acts 15 in the AD 50, that one we do know, right? 3 years gap. He writes this between the foundation of these churches around 47 and the Council of Jerusalem in AD 50, okay, the first church council. So it's gone from church plants, so from nothing to something, to, in the midst of an ecclesiastical civil war, almost overrun by heresy in like a year and a half, 2 years, right? It's spread like wildfire, absolute wildfire, this thing, right? And so that's how dangerous it can become, okay? And they are abusing you, they're using you, they're misusing you, they are manipulating you, they are coercing you, all these kinds of things, right? So really what's being said here with the latter clause of verse 12 and then the 2 clauses of verse 13, simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ, cowardice. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, hypocrisy. But they want to have you uncircumcised, so they want to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. Like they use you as a propaganda tool, they use you as a useful idiot, etc., etc. Manipulation / coercion, right, or insidiousness. Okay, so they're cowards, they are hypocrites, and they are abusers, is what he is saying, in no real uncertain terms here. Okay, that's how you would categorize these things, right? Obviously, this discourse continues through verses 14, 15, and 16, which we'll cover in coming lessons, right? But we'll pause there and end there, and then cover those lessons, those verses in the upcoming lessons. But this is giving us this picture. This is how he's choosing to conclude this letter, with his own hand, as he says, right? He has taken the writing instrument. He's writing in his own hand in large letters, right? So it's really obvious what I'm saying, right? And he's trying desperately to get through to these people, right? Because as he has often said, especially in chapter 5, all these places that he writes letters to, he's the one who founded these churches. Do you know what I mean? Right? Different apostles founded different churches. We have some of them in Scripture, we have a number of them not in Scripture, right? Mark, as in Gospel author Mark, founds Antioch and brings Christianity to the Egyptians, right? That's not in the Scriptures, but we have that from other historical sources. St. Andrew going up to Armenia, St. Thomas going all the way over to India, right? We have all these kinds of accounts from elsewhere, right? But the ones in Scripture that we have that are focused on those specific regions, Paul is the one who founds basically all of them, right? Other than Jerusalem and Antioch. And so these churches of Galatia, like I said, he personally visited. He was, especially Galatia, where he was stoned within basically an inch of his life in Derbe, okay? He put his body on the line, literally speaking, and he actually makes reference to that in verse 17. We'll get onto that in its own lesson. For I bear on my body the marks of Christ. It's a bit of a pun, but long story short, we'll get onto that in that sense. He's saying that to them because he was brutally stoned and basically left for dead by the Jews in that city, okay, and others who had riled up the Roman authorities. So he has skin in the game, literally almost in this sense. He has a deep emotional and spiritual investment in these people, in these churches, right? And he is like a spiritual father to them. They are like spiritual children to him, and vice versa, okay? That's why this betrayal is something that's just that, a betrayal as far as he's concerned. They're betraying God, that goes without saying, but they're actually also betraying him, okay? Because God chose him and used him to bring the faith to them. Apostoles, sent out. Right? That's where we get the word apostle from. And so God chose him for this, to do this, to bring this to them. He becomes like a spiritual father to them. It's why historically in the church, even in the early church, ministers were often referred to as fathers in that sense, right? You don't have to do that, right? Different traditions have different views on that. But that's why there was a term of endearment, right? Because he calls the Corinthians his children, and he refers to himself as a father to them, right? So it does come from Scripture. But point being is that he is seeing his own spiritual children, so to speak, being led astray and carried off into heresy by cowards, by hypocrites, by manipulative abusers, right? And that's why in the previous chapters he said it'd be better if these people just castrated themselves and bled out and died. Right? And we had a whole lesson on that subject, by the way. We had a whole lesson on that subject about the concept of niceness and how it's not a biblical virtue, right? Righteousness is a biblical virtue. Kindness is a virtue, like we saw in the previous chapter, right? One of the fruit of the Spirit, right? But kindness is different from the modern, very French concept of niceness, from where we get that word, right? From the 17th century or 18th century onward. Constantly seeking to be polite, even if it results in compromise. Constantly seeking to avoid conflict as opposed to being willing to stand for a right conflict, right? Exactly what he's actually condemning in the end of verse 12, right? Simply said that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. That's the cowardice element. All these kinds of things, right? He's laying it on pretty thick here. But then contrast it with what we'll see in the coming lessons, right? So let's end there.